Someone needs to tell Chairman Barton that he's got a live mic on. Good morning, panelists. Thanks for joining us this morning. I have on stage, coming from this way, Francis Beinecke from the Natural Resources Defense Council, Ross Eisenberg from the National Association of Manufacturers. We have David Goldwyn from Brookings, and Sarah Ladislaw from CSIS. Let's dive right in. You heard this panel pretty much rule Congress out legislatively for action here, and we're just getting started in 2014. What are you most disappointed about that we're not going to see happen? What's the one thing that, if Congress could move on energy, what would you most like to see them tackle this year? Let's just kind of go down the line.
That's a great question. I mean, I think that it's become so normal to count them out in terms of sort of legislative action. I think that what I'd really like to see from Congress is not necessarily anything that will pass, but something that passes muster as creative, right? I mean, I think and unfortunately, I think what you see so many times in the debate we have right now is we get wrapped around the axle on, particular issues at a time when the energy industry in the United States is fundamentally more dynamic than it has been in a very, very long time. I mean, we're an internationally oriented think tank. People from around the world are coming here to find out what's happening and what it means for them, both on the climate change agenda and on, fossil fuel development and on technology development. And so I feel like a lot of time and intelligence is wasted on sort of, getting wrapped around the axle on very conventional issues that definitely need an answer, right? But we may not be at a place where we have a readily available answer. And so if nothing's going to happen, maybe some real creative thinking would be in order, and then that lets the states and local communities and maybe the executive branch, do something with those things.
David, throw your best idea at the wall. What do you think Congress, if you wish they could do one thing on energy, what would it be?
Probably pass Portman-Shaheen. I think that's the one piece of legislation that they need to pass. I would say otherwise, I'm not unhappy with Congress not acting in the energy space. I think most of the debate right now is, will we have the infrastructure that we need? Will the coal rules that EPA is putting in place be effective for climate? Can we permit the infrastructure that we need, both for LNG and for pipelines to move our resources around the country? All that is really this classic debate between whether the executive branch is moving quickly enough, and if not, whether Congress will pass legislation to force them to move more quickly. So while we're seeing, several of those bills, deadlines for LNG permits, deadlines for cross-border permits out there, I think it's in the hands of the executive branch actually to move more swiftly. And President Obama, with his executive order, wants to move all infrastructure quickly. Oil and gas doesn't seem to be quite in that basket. And so I can see in the next year, two things the administration could do that would help move this. On LNG export permits, 21 permit applicants, maybe 6 are going to make it. They could just declare, as EPAC 2005 requires, that 90 days after FERC approves a permit, they're going to move through. Or anybody who gets through FERC and is commercially ready, they go to the head of the line. On the pipelines, the pipeline who cannot be named aside, I think they could just move a lot more quickly, or you might even see the administration move that authority for cross-border pipelines, maybe to FERC. Maybe the State Department doesn't really want it.
Ross, inertia on Capitol Hill, how do you feel about that? And would you say that there is one thing that even NAM would like to see Congress tackle here?
Well, if we're talking about the realm of the possible, we certainly would put energy efficiency and TSCA reform at the top of that list. There's two things that we see in the realm of the possible that we'd love to see get done, given the current Congress. If we're talking wish lists, we would love to see Congress re-engage in some fashion on greenhouse gases and try to draw some lines around what EPA is doing and give them a reasonable path forward. Whether it's Whitfield Mansion or something like that, we support Whitfield Mansion. But that's at or near the top of my wish list.
And Francis Beinecke, how about, I know the environmental community has a lot of things that you would love to see Congress try and do in the realm of the wish list, but how about in the world of the possible?
Well, I think in the world of the possible, focusing on efficiency is really important. There's an opportunity. Most people agree on it around the country. Creates jobs. It would be a really good thing for Congress to do. Also, a consistent policy on renewables, having a tax credit that actually kept renewables going without this back and forth, and uncertainty to unleash clean energy would really, really be important. And ultimately, we have to have legislation on climate. I don't think it's going to happen this year. I don't think it's going to happen next year. And I think that the administration's action on the EPA rules is absolutely critical to get going on climate change. So that's not going to be in Congress's domain, hopefully, and at least as an affirmative action on reducing carbon emissions. But EPA has the pen on this one, and they really need to move forward.
Do you see, I mean, not in the next 2 years on climate, but I mean, if you could game it out, do you think that we're going to come back to a climate debate in the next 5, 10 years, that this is going to actually work its way back up to the hill, whether it be cap and trade or whether it be a carbon tax or some other method to try and control carbon? Or are we moving completely away from the legislative approach and we're headed into a...
Congress absolutely has to come back to climate. This is a grave concern for the country and the planet. It's something that's being taken up international. We're in international negotiations on it. So I don't think it's going to be in the near term, but I think 4 to 6 years, it has to be addressed. And I actually think what will happen is we'll put in standards on power plants. We will unleash clean energy as it's being unleashed across the country right now. There are 186,000 jobs that have been created on clean energy in the last 2 years. By the time Congress gets around to it, it's actually going to be happening in states all across the country, and it'll be an easier thing to do.
National Association of Manufacturers is fighting, obviously, the EPA climate rules pretty hard. Where is this going in your mind? Do you think that we are ultimately headed to a place where Congress is going to have to weigh in here again?
I actually take the opposite view. I firmly believe this is our policy, and it's not a particularly good one, but the farther down we get down this regulatory path, and it becomes our policy. I mean, think about how, I mean, I would argue that we are dealing with greenhouse gases, just not in a particularly good or coordinated way right now. We have the Clean Air Act, which is being rolled out in a particularly dangerous way for both for the power sector and for manufacturers down the road. NEPA is being used as really the front lines on the battle on climate change, where you have climate change being applied on a project-by-project basis, which is what you see on Keystone. You see it on a lot of the energy export projects and things of that nature. I would argue that's as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than some of the other laws that are being used for this. So we have a very haphazard, uncoordinated way of getting to this. And I think that the more that we do and the more that it expands, the more that we are stuck with a very unworkable regulatory policy on greenhouse gases and climate change.
David, you've been in the State Department diplomatic realm as well. Talk about, we've got Paris and France negotiations leading up in 2015 on the climate talks. Where do you see sort of the global climate dynamic going, and where the U.S. is right now? Are we heading for another Copenhagen-like disaster where, lots of expectations build up, but ultimately nothing happens and we're kind of continuing in this endless cycle here?
Well, I don't have high expectations for the first round, but I wouldn't call the Copenhagen Accords a total disaster. It was, the best deal that could be gotten at the time. But frankly, if we make the pivot even to Keystone XL, Canada is going to have to find a way to meet its greenhouse gas emissions target. It's going to have to look at oil and gas regulations and others to do Keystone and everything else. And the reason they're going to do that is Copenhagen. So I think really the rollout for the next couple of years, and I think Secretary Kerry understands this, is that the big rocks in the climate debate are China and India and what you do there. And I think the real solution, the bridge, is probably going to be ways to increase gas penetration in China and India as a substitution for coal. That's the big decrease. So I think we're going to have national plans. I think we're going to have technology assistance, and I think we're going to have a policy that moves the markets to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. But I don't see binding targets, in the next round.
Sarah, can you talk a little bit about the international climate negotiations and where we're headed here? Do you see this as something that is moving forward with progress, or are we kind of in a perpetual state of?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a, and I don't even know what sports analogy to pick, but we've got a problem where we tend to look at the climate negotiations as having to be a slam dunk or a home run or something that feels a lot more satisfying and conclusive than what's actually going to happen. And I think in between sort of Copenhagen and now, where I think the narrative is, okay, the climate change debate has either gone away or become so contentious that there is no middle ground, there's actually a great deal of moderation that's happened that is overall very helpful to the debate, right? I mean, you've got an administration now, which I'm not trying to defend their position necessarily, but it's all of you have energy strategy that's trying to support domestic oil and gas production, but also move towards a lower carbon economy, right? That's probably not satisfying to either end, but makes a lot of sense. Focus more on adaptation and technology development and a commitment to the science. Those are all the things that you need to have a wholehearted climate policy. I think that debate that we've sort of switched to not necessarily an all or nothing debate somewhere in the center is really important. And I think that while people have been paying less attention to the climate negotiations, I think they've actually moved in a way that are probably a lot more pragmatic for people who don't occupy ends of the spectrum. And I think what you're going to start seeing is towards the end of this year, people are going to realize there's another big ramp up coming to a big meeting in 2015 where we're going to have to talk about the future again. And post 2020 is where there's a lot of places to try and figure out where we're headed. And so I think we're actually going to see that debate come back in a pretty fulsome way, but probably after sort of the end of this year.
Sure. Francis, we just heard Congressman Barton just a moment ago say on the Keystone Pipeline, I think he said it was in the bag and there was no way this couldn't be approved. Obviously, this is a decision Secretary Kerry and President Obama are making, and you're putting enormous pressure, the environmental community is putting enormous pressure on the president to reject the pipeline. Do you think you're going to be successful in this?
I do think we are. I think that actually the State Department analysis shows where, for the first time, does a full climate analysis. It gives the president the information he needs. It addresses the test that he directed on his June 25th climate statement. This will exacerbate climate emissions both in this country and in Canada. It will expand tar sands development there. And the president is going to make it a national interest decision, and we expect him to turn it down. And I think that there's more and more evidence that climate emissions are going up. These are the dirtiest fuels on the planet. There has to be a strategic decision whether we're going to go down a clean energy path or continually go ahead with fossil fuel development that is destructive to the climate. So it's definitely in his hands, and we think that the information is there. The analysis is quite complete, and in the climate case, it exacerbates the problem. It fails his test, and he should turn it down.
Let's go down the line on Keystone. What do you think?
On its merits, this project is in the national interest. We've thought so for a number of years. I mean, when this permit was first submitted, I'm a Phillies fan. The Phillies were the World Series champs back then. I mean, it seems like ages ago. It's getting to the point, quite frankly, for a lot of my members and a lot of investors around the world that it's a sign that the U.S. isn't necessarily open for business. I mean, this would be a strong signal, particularly in light of the president's statements in the State of the Union that he was going to cut red tape for infrastructure projects. Well, here's Exhibit A. Right? There is no bigger poster child for red tape that needs to be cut for infrastructure projects than this project right here. So it's in the national interest. It's been shown again and again and again for economic reasons and energy reasons and all of those national security reasons that it's in the national interest. Enough already. It's time to move.
Well, I have a slightly different reading of the environmental impact statement. I think the way I read that one, like the three EISs and the Energy Department study before, is it said, again, that the Canadians are going to produce this oil one way or the other. Either it will come by rail and truck, or it will go west, or it will come here. But the pipeline is not the proximate cause of increased production. And the alternative modes, particularly rail, will have a much higher greenhouse gas emissions profile than a pipeline will, aside from the pipeline versus rail safety issues. So therefore, the environmental impact is relatively negligible, and even the substitution impact, if you count how far Saudi Arabian heavy or Venezuelan heavy or Mexican heavy travels, is 1 to 20 million tons. So I think it's very hard for the State Department to construct a national interest determination that says it's not in the national interest. The energy security piece of it, one way or the other, 830,000 barrels a day by land, by pipe, not subject to weather. Economic, it's got jobs. You can argue about the numbers, and the cultural and social benefits have been addressed. So I think it's kind of hard to say no. What I hope is there'll be a refocus, that the president will encourage the Canadians to be more granular about how they're going to meet their Copenhagen targets, and that all of this tremendous energy in the environmental movement will focus on the big rocks in that debate, which are going to be the coal rules, and will be continued implementation of the fuel efficiency, because when you get those mobile sources and the stationary sources, then you're really making progress.
Sarah, this is a huge political question for the president. Obviously, the environmental community has invested so much in trying to influence this decision. Do you think that they made a mistake by focusing so much on making this a test on President Obama's green credentials at this point?
The environmental movement?
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. It's been tremendously effective for them. I mean, I don't think it's great for U.S. energy policy, but that's not necessarily the question. One of the things that I think it was very useful for is sort of post-Copenhagen, post-cap and trade. It's a focal point, right? Yeah. And so it's a focal point that is serving as a litmus test for where the country stands on a low carbon pathway. Now, that's fine, but my question has always been, what do you do post Keystone? After a yes or no, it is not the last pipeline that will get permitted on the North American continent, you will have more. So what do you do to make a decision that is the establishment of further policy, right? And so unfortunately, I think rather than move the debate forward, I feel like it sort of holds up the debate, which is about one pipeline and one project. If it was, because I fundamentally, I'm maybe in the minority. I know it seems implausible, but I don't actually think a decision is coming anytime soon because I don't think the politics on it are exactly clear. So if you continue this place where you don't have a decision, you have massive amounts of unintended consequences on both sides, right? And you're not actually getting to the heart of the debate. So I support what David was saying, which is let's refocus on some other things and that look like and communicate sort of a stronger, more robust, more effective on both sides of the ledger pathway forward for climate change.
Perhaps the Chicago Cubs will win the World Series before we get a decision out of President. We can only hope. What comes next after the Keystone decision? Yes or no, Francis?
Well, the most important thing are the carbon rules for power plants, and we're on target, or EPA is on target to come out with a proposed rule in June. That's the single largest thing we can do to reduce emissions. We can get a major reduction, as 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions are power plants, and we can bring that down, get the U.S. on the trajectory for the 17% reduction that the president committed to. And this is a huge and very significant step forward on climate. It's the absolute centerpiece of the president's climate plan, and it is where the environmental community is focused. There were 3 million comments supporting the proposed rule for new plants. We expect even more this year. People are galvanized in every state across the country to address this issue. So there is tremendous tension, a priority focused on the largest single thing we can do, which is reduce emissions from our power sector. And we're completely organized and galvanized on that. So nobody should think that we're not focusing on a very important commitment the president's made and ensuring that he will meet that commitment.
Okay, Francis, we're going to give you the last word here. It's time to wrap up this conversation. We have our next panel coming in a minute. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.